What if I told you that the elegant ladies and distinguished gentlemen of Victorian England, those stern-faced figures in sepia photographs who seemed to embody propriety and refinement, were walking around in a state of filth that would make a modern person recoil in horror? That beneath those layers of silk and wool, those perfectly pressed linens and polished boots, lay bodies that hadn't seen a proper bath in weeks, sometimes months? The Victorian era, that supposed golden age of moral rectitude and social advancement, was built on one of history's greatest deceptions: the illusion that looking clean was the same as being clean. We've been sold a lie about the Victorians. The history books show us their grand houses, their elaborate fashions, their technological marvels. But they don't tell us about the stench. They don't mention that a Victorian ballroom, filled with hundreds of people in their finest attire, would assault your nostrils with a cocktail of unwashed bodies, heavy perfumes, and the acrid smoke of coal fires. They don't explain that the very people who conquered empires and built railways were terrified of something as simple as a bar of soap and a tub of warm water. This is not a story about ignorant people who simply didn't know better. This is a story about an entire civilization that constructed an elaborate system of false cleanliness, a culture that confused appearance with reality so thoroughly that they poisoned themselves in pursuit of purity. To understand the truth about Victorian hygiene, we must strip away the velvet curtains and peer into the shadows, where the real work of maintaining civilization was done by people whose own bodies bore the cost of others' comfort. The question isn't simply whether the Victorians bathed. The question is, what does their relationship with cleanliness reveal about the gap between what a society believes about itself and what it actually is? Chapter 1. The Fad of Victorian Luxury, a World of Illusions. Step into a grand Victorian townhouse in 1850 London, and your senses are immediately assaulted by contradictions. The mahogany gleams under gaslight, the Persian carpets muffle your footsteps, and crystal decanters catch the amber glow of the fire. Everything appears immaculate, ordered, civilized. But breathe deeply, and beneath the lavender water and rose pomade, you detect something else: the unmistakable musk of bodies that have been wrapped in wool and silk for hours, days, sometimes weeks without the cleansing touch of water. This was the Victorian genius, the transformation of hygiene from a matter of health into a performance of status. The Victorian gentleman standing before you in his black frock coat represents the pinnacle of this deception. That coat, tailored to perfection and brushed to a lustrous sheen, is actually a repository of absorbed toxins. In a city choked by pea superfogs, thick yellow smog laden with coal tar and sulfur, that heavy wool absorbed the environment like a living sponge. And here lies the first shocking truth: you could not wash a Victorian wool coat. There was no dry cleaning as we understand it. To submerge such a garment in water would destroy its shape and finish. So how was it cleaned? It wasn't. It was brushed, vigorously and daily, by a valet whose lungs likely blackened from the dust and particles he beat from the fabric. But the sweat, the oils, the accumulated odors of 1,000 cigars and crowded drawing rooms remained, layered into the fibers year after year. The Victorian philosophy of cleanliness rested on a fundamental misconception: that the undergarments could do the work of washing. They believed that white linen acted as a wick, drawing impurities and toxins from the body and trapping them in the fabric. Therefore, if one changed their shirt daily, or even twice daily among the wealthy, the body itself was considered clean. This was cleanliness by proxy, hygiene through delegation. A gentleman's respectability was measured not by how often he bathed, but by the sheer volume of his laundry bills. Consider the Victorian lady, that vision of ethereal purity floating through the drawing room in clouds of lace and silk. Her reality was far more suffocating than her appearance suggested. Once dressed for the day, she was sealed inside a complex fortress of fabric, chemise, drawers, corset cover, multiple petticoats, bustle or crinoline, And finally, the gown itself. This wasn't merely fashion, it was a microclimate. 20 pounds of clothing created a sealed environment where perspiration had nowhere to go, and heat had no means of escape. The heavy, cloying perfumes so popular in the era, rich florals mixed with animal scents like musk and civet, weren't aesthetic choices. They were functional necessities, olfactory veils, designed to mask the inevitable consequences of sealing a human body inside layers of fabric for 12 to 16 hours at a time. The home itself participated in this grand deception. Victorian interiors, with their heavy velvet drapes, overstuffed furniture, and dark wood paneling, were designed to display wealth, but they also served as traps for dust and contamination. In an era before vacuum cleaners or electric lighting, dust was a living presence composed of soot from fireplaces, dried horse manure blown in from the streets, textile fibers, and the constant shedding of human skin. Servants would sweep and beat rugs, but this often merely redistributed the filth into the air, where it would settle again on every surface. The visual language of the era, darkness, heavy patterns, rich colors, may have been intentionally designed to hide the grime. In rooms lit only by flickering gas lamps or candles, stains disappeared into shadows, and the elaborate patterns on wallpapers and carpets camouflaged the soot that inevitably accumulated. But what happened when the performance ended? When the drawing room doors closed and the gas lamps were turned low? If the linen was doing the work of cleaning and the perfume was masking the evidence, what was happening to the actual human skin underneath all those layers? The answer lies in understanding that Victorian cleanliness was never about the body. It was about everything that surrounded the body, and maintaining that illusion required an army of invisible workers whose own relationship with cleanliness was far more complicated and far more costly than their employers could imagine. Chapter 2: The Invisible World. Servants behind the curtain. Follow the sound of splashing water and clinking metal down the narrow servants' staircase, where the plush carpets give way to cold stone and the wallpaper fades to bare plaster. Here, in the basement and attic rooms where the real work of Victorian life was done, hygiene wasn't a matter of etiquette or social signaling. It was back-breaking labor measured in buckets, burns, and aching muscles. The Victorian bath, when it occurred at all, was not the relaxing ritual we imagine today. It was a logistical nightmare that required the coordinated effort of multiple servants and could consume the better part of a morning. To understand why the Victorians bathed so infrequently, we must calculate the mathematics of the task itself. A proper hip bath, the portable metal tub that was hauled into bedrooms for the occasion, required 30 to 40 gallons of water to be even remotely comfortable. Water weighs over 8 pounds per gallon, meaning that each bath required moving more than 300 pounds of water. This water had to be hand-pumped in the scullery, heated on the coal range in large copper kettles, and then carried, 2 boiling kettles at a time, up 4 or 5 flights of narrow, poorly lit stairs to the master's bedroom. Picture the scullery maid, her hands already raw and chapped from constant contact with lye soap and scalding water, making trip after trip up those stairs. Her muscles scream with the effort, sweat stings her eyes despite the cold, and her arms shake from the weight of the kettles. She makes this journey 8, 10, 12 times to fill a single tub. And the labor doesn't end when the bath is drawn. The temperature must be tested and adjusted. Towels must be warmed by the fire. Fresh soap must be prepared. And when the master has finished his soak, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes of luxury, the now gray cooling water doesn't magically disappear. It must be bailed out bucket by bucket and carried all the way back down those stairs to be dumped in the scullery drain or the backyard cesspit. Is it any wonder that full baths were weekly or monthly events, rather than daily routines? The sheer human cost made frequent bathing prohibitively expensive in terms of labor, fuel, and time. But there's a darker irony at work here. The people responsible for creating cleanliness for others lived in conditions that would horrify modern observers. Servants' quarters were typically crammed into attics directly under the roof, freezing in winter, stifling in summer, or relegated to damp basement rooms. They were often denied access to the very amenities they provided for their employers. A maid who spent her morning hauling hot water for the lady of the house might be lucky to wash her own face with cold, leftover water at the end of a 16-hour workday. This created a bizarre and uncomfortable intimacy between the classes. The upper classes lived in close quarters with the people they considered the great unwashed, yet they depended entirely on their touch. The valet knew the smell of his master's body more intimately than anyone. The lady's maid, who laced her mistress into her corset each morning, was intimately acquainted with the state of her undergarments and the condition of her skin. There was a silent, unspoken knowledge that passed between the classes. The servants handled the chamber pots, washed the menstrual rags, scrubbed the sweat stains from silk gowns, and witnessed the biological reality that the elaborate rituals of respectability were designed to hide. This proximity bred a specific kind of anxiety in the upper classes. They were terrified of contamination from the lower orders, yet they couldn't survive without their touch. They devised strict architectural and social rules to manage this contradiction. Servants used separate staircases, turned their faces to the wall when masters passed, and were expected to be invisible except when their labor was specifically required. But no amount of segregation could change the fundamental fact that the same hands that scrubbed coal grates and emptied chamber pots also prepared food and laid out clean clothing. The servants themselves existed in a strange hygiene paradox. They were the agents of cleanliness, yet often its last beneficiaries. They scrubbed and polished and laundered from dawn to dusk, creating the illusion of purity for others, while living with dirt ground into their own fingernails, soot in their own hair, and the permanent stains of their labor marking their skin. They understood the reality of Victorian hygiene better than anyone. It was a system built on the invisible suffering of those who made it possible. But even this army of workers, sweating and straining to maintain the fiction of cleanliness, couldn't overcome a more fundamental problem. The Victorians weren't just avoiding frequent bathing because it was difficult. They were avoiding it because they genuinely believed it could kill them. Chapter 3. The Science of Fear: How Medicine Made Water the Enemy. To understand the Victorian relationship with bathing, we must enter their medical worldview and see water not as the benign cleansing substance we know today, but as a dangerous element capable of causing weakness, disease, and death. This wasn't superstition or ignorance. It was scientific orthodoxy, taught in medical schools and prescribed by respected physicians. The dominant medical theory of the early Victorian era was miasmatism, the belief that diseases were caused by miasma, or bad air emanating from rotting organic matter. But equally influential was the humoral understanding of the body, which held that health depended on maintaining the proper balance of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this theory, bathing, especially in hot water, disrupted this delicate balance by opening the pores and allowing the humors to escape or harmful external influences to enter. Dr. Charles White, a prominent Manchester physician, warned that while cold baths might have some benefits, warm baths were dangerous and should be avoided except in cases of specific medical necessity. Other doctors went further, arguing that frequent bathing of any kind could lead to weakness, susceptibility to disease, and even death. These weren't fringe opinions. They appeared in respected medical journals and shaped public health policy. The fear was rooted in observable correlation that was mistaken for causation. During plague outbreaks, public bathhouses were often closed because they seemed to spread disease. This wasn't entirely wrong. Crowded bathhouses with shared unheated water could indeed transmit infections. But the lesson the public drew was not that bathhouses needed better sanitation, but that bathing itself was inherently dangerous. When people fell ill shortly after bathing, the bath was blamed, regardless of other factors that might have contributed to their illness. This medical anxiety was compounded by the genuine dangers of the water supply itself. In rapidly industrializing cities, clean water was increasingly scarce. Rivers that had once run clear were now filled with industrial waste, human sewage, and animal carcasses. The Thames, flowing through the heart of London, was so polluted that members of Parliament had to soak the curtains of the Houses of Parliament in chloride of lime during the Great Stink of 1858, when the smell became so overwhelming that government business nearly ground to a halt. For most Victorians, water came from wells, pumps, or rivers, and there was no reliable way to determine its safety. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were all transmitted through contaminated water, and outbreaks were frequent and deadly. In this context, the fear of water wasn't entirely irrational. If you couldn't see the bacteria and had no way to purify the water, avoiding it for something as seemingly frivolous as bathing made a certain kind of sense. Children were considered especially vulnerable. Victorian parenting manuals warned against bathing infants too frequently, recommending instead that they be wiped down with damp cloths. When baths were given, the water should be lukewarm at most, and the child should be in and out as quickly as possible. Some doctors recommended that children not be fully bathed until they were several months old, arguing that the waxy coating covering newborns was natural protection that shouldn't be washed away. This fear of water transformed hygiene into a practice of strategic avoidance. Instead of immersion, the Victorians developed elaborate rituals of dry cleaning, not the chemical process we know today, but techniques designed to maintain the appearance of cleanliness without the perceived dangers of water. They practiced what was called the sponge bath, a small basin of water, perhaps with a splash of vinegar or cologne, and a cloth for washing only the critical areas: face, hands, underarms, and groin. The body was never fully exposed to air or water at once. It was a fragmented cleaning, a maintenance of parts, rather than a purification of the whole. As the century progressed and germ theory began to challenge miasmatic beliefs, attitudes slowly shifted. The work of John Snow, who traced cholera outbreaks to contaminated water pumps, and later Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, who demonstrated that diseases were caused by microorganisms rather than bad air, revolutionized medical understanding. Suddenly, soap and water weren't dangerous. They were protective. The old medical advice wasn't just wrong, it was actively harmful. But changing deeply held beliefs about something as fundamental as bathing took time, and the infrastructure to support regular bathing for the masses didn't exist. Even as the science changed, the practical realities of Victorian life meant that most people continued to live with limited access to clean hot water. Chapter 4. The Urban Nightmare, When Cities Became Sewers. To truly grasp the sensory reality of Victorian life, we must step outside the private homes and into the public spaces, where the consequences of poor hygiene became impossible to ignore. The Industrial Revolution had drawn millions of people into cities that were utterly unprepared for them, creating urban environments that were quite literally toxic. The infrastructure of medieval England was collapsing under the weight of modern population density. Most houses relied on cesspools, brick-lined pits in basements or backyards where human waste was collected. These pits were not sealed systems. They leaked, overflowed, and contaminated the very soil on which the city was built. The liquid filth seeped into the groundwater, contaminating the pumps that provided drinking water for entire neighborhoods. It seeped through building foundations, filling elegant parlors with the smell of methane and decay. The night soil men were the grim heroes of this system, workers who were paid to shovel out these overflowing pits under cover of darkness while the city slept. They were the pariahs of Victorian society, reeking permanently of their trade, yet they were the only thing standing between urban civilization and complete biological collapse. Without their labor, performed in conditions that would violate every modern safety regulation, the cities would have drowned in their own waste within weeks. But the horror wasn't confined to individual properties. All the overflow from cesspools, all the runoff from slaughterhouses, all the chemical refuse from tanneries and factories was dumped directly into the rivers. The Thames became London's toilet, a flowing repository of human and industrial waste that somehow also served as the source of drinking water for much of the city. The summer of 1858 brought this system to its apocalyptic breaking point in an event known as the Great Stink. A heat wave baked the city, and the Thames began to ferment. The smell was so overpowering that it reportedly made people vomit in the streets. It penetrated every building, including Parliament itself, forcing politicians to conduct business with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces and curtains soaked in disinfectant. The government nearly ceased to function, paralyzed by the stench of its own capital city. The Great Stink shattered the Victorian illusion that hygiene could be a private matter. The smell didn't respect social boundaries. It drifted impartially into the slums of the East End and the ballrooms of Mayfair. It proved that cleanliness couldn't be achieved through individual effort alone. It required collective action and massive public investment. This crisis gave birth to the sanitary movement, led by reformers like Edwin Chadwick, who argued that filth wasn't just unpleasant, it was a killer. They pushed for the construction of comprehensive sewer systems, the provision of clean water supplies, and the regulation of industrial waste. The engineering marvel of Joseph Bazalgette's London sewer system, built in response to the Great Stink, still serves the city today and represents one of the greatest public health achievements of the Victorian era. But even as these grand projects were undertaken, the daily reality for most urban Victorians remained harsh. The air was thick with coal smoke, creating the famous London fog that was actually toxic smog. It coated everything in a layer of greasy black soot so pervasive that a gentleman could walk from his front door to his carriage and find his white shirt cuffs grayed by the air alone. The working classes, crowded into tenements with no running water, no adequate heating, and often no privacy, faced impossible choices. Bathing wasn't just inconvenient, it was nearly impossible. Water had to be carried from communal pumps that might be streets away. It had to be heated over fires that many families couldn't afford to keep burning. And all of this had to be done in spaces that were already overcrowded and lacking in basic amenities. In winter, when temperatures inside these buildings could drop below freezing, the idea of stripping naked to wash with cold water wasn't just unpleasant, it was potentially deadly. The middle and upper classes responded to these urban horrors by retreating further into their private worlds of perfume and performance. But they couldn't entirely escape the toxicity of their environment. The soot settled on their windowsills, the smells seeped through their walls, and the contaminated air filled their lungs regardless of their social status. Their elaborate rituals of cleanliness were in many ways desperate attempts to maintain the illusion of purity in a fundamentally poisoned environment. This environmental crisis also revealed the class dynamics of Victorian hygiene. The wealthy could afford to move to suburbs with cleaner air and better drainage. They could pay for servants to haul water and maintain their homes. The poor had no such options. They lived with the dirt, the smell, and the diseases that came with urban squalor. And society blamed them for it, characterizing the poor as naturally dirty and morally degraded, rarely acknowledging that poverty itself made cleanliness nearly impossible. Chapter 5: The Toxic Pursuit of Purity, When Beauty Became Poison. In their desperate quest to appear clean in an irredeemably dirty world, the Victorians turned to solutions that were often more dangerous than the problems they were meant to solve. The Victorian beauty industry was built on a foundation of toxic substances that slowly poisoned the very people who used them in pursuit of an impossible ideal of purity. The Victorian standard of beauty demanded skin that looked like marble, pale, translucent, and utterly untouched by the sun or the grime of daily life. But human skin is not marble. It has texture, color, and natural variations that the Victorian eye found unacceptable. To achieve this impossible standard, both men and women turned to cosmetics that were essentially chemical weapons disguised as beauty products. The most popular face powders and skin creams contained lead and arsenic. The same arsenic used to poison rats was consumed in small wafers or applied directly to the skin to encourage a pale, bloodless complexion. It worked by destroying red blood cells, literally making users anemic to achieve the desired ghostly pallor. The eyes were brightened with drops of belladonna, deadly nightshade, which dilated the pupils to create a fashionable doe-eyed look while causing blindness, heart palpitations, and neurological damage over time. This was the ultimate expression of Victorian hygiene's fundamental contradiction. The fear of natural dirt led to the embrace of artificial toxins. They were terrified of the organic filth of sweat and soil, yet they willingly coated their bodies with heavy metals. The message was clear. Clean didn't mean healthy. Clean meant artificial. It meant removing all traces of the biological human animal and replacing it with a painted, sculpted poison doll. The toxicity extended to cleaning products themselves. To keep white linens blindingly white in a city of coal smoke, laundresses used harsh caustics, lye, and ammonia that burned their hands and scarred their lungs. The smell of clean in a Victorian home was often the smell of chemical burns. The maids who scrubbed floors suffered not only from housemaids' knee, painful swelling from hours of kneeling on hard surfaces, but also from respiratory damage caused by inhaling the fumes of lead-based paints and aggressive cleaning agents. Hair care presented its own toxic challenges. Women's hair, often reaching to the waist or beyond, was washed perhaps once a month due to the difficulty of the process and the belief that frequent washing was harmful. Between washings, they used dry shampoos made of powdered starch or flour, which could attract insects if not thoroughly removed. When hair was washed, it was often treated with solutions containing mercury or other heavy metals to achieve fashionable colors or textures. The power dynamics of this toxic beauty culture were particularly stark. The aristocrat's comfort was literally bought with the servant's health, and the aristocrat's beauty was bought with their own health. The wealthy could afford the most expensive and therefore most dangerous cosmetics, while their servants suffered from exposure to the cleaning chemicals that maintained the illusion of purity. Men were not immune to these toxic practices. Pomades for hair often contained lead, and the popular practice of using mercury-based treatments for various ailments led to mercury poisoning among gentlemen who could afford such medical attention. The stiff collars that were the hallmark of respectability were often starched with substances that caused skin irritation and respiratory problems. There's a tragic irony in the Victorian moralization of cleanliness. They preach that cleanliness is next to godliness, while poisoning themselves in pursuit of that godliness. They judged the poor for their filth, while ignoring the fact that the poor lacked access to clean water and safe living conditions. They turned hygiene into a weapon of class warfare, using it to distinguish the civilized from the savage, all while slowly destroying their own bodies with the very substances they believed made them pure. The Victorian beauty industry also reveals how societies can become trapped in cycles of harm that seem rational within their own context. Each toxic product was a response to a real problem. Pale skin did hide blemishes. Lead-based paints did create brilliant whites. Mercury treatments did sometimes alleviate symptoms of disease, but the long-term consequences were devastating, and the cycle of toxicity became self-perpetuating as each generation passed down both the beauty standards and the dangerous methods for achieving them. As the Victorian era progressed and scientific understanding improved, some of these practices began to change, but the psychological patterns they established, the association of cleanliness with moral worth, the willingness to sacrifice health for appearance, the use of hygiene as a marker of social status, persisted well into the 20th century and continue to influence our relationship with beauty and cleanliness today. Chapter 6. The Mirror of History: What the Victorians Reveal About Ourselves. As we step back from this journey through the sensory landscape of Victorian hygiene, we're left with a complex and unsettling picture. The Victorians weren't simply dirty people who didn't know better. They were a civilization under siege, fighting a war against an environment that was actively trying to kill them, armed with bad science, rigid social hierarchies, and a desperate desire for order in an increasingly chaotic world. They created a culture of hygiene based on appearance rather than health, substituting performance for reality in ways that seem almost incomprehensible to us today. They feared water while embracing poison, trusted linen more than soap, and built elaborate social rituals around the avoidance of the very practices that could have saved their lives. Yet within their own context, these choices made sense. They were logical responses to the information they had and the constraints they faced. The Victorian story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own era. We mock their fear of bathing from the comfort of our climate-controlled, plumbed, and sanitized modern lives. But what are we wrong about? What practices do we cling to today that future generations will find equally baffling and harmful? What are the arsenic wafers of our time, the toxic habits we embrace for the sake of beauty, convenience, or social acceptance? The Victorians teach us that hygiene is never just about biology. It's about culture, class, power, and the stories we tell ourselves to feel civilized in an uncertain world. Their struggle was visible, pungent, and immediate. Ours may be cleaner on the surface, but it's no less complex. We've inherited their discomfort with the human body, their association of cleanliness with moral worth, and their tendency to judge others based on their hygiene practices. Perhaps most importantly, the Victorian experience reminds us that progress is not inevitable and that knowledge is not the same as wisdom. The Victorians had access to soap, water, and the basic principles of cleanliness, but they were trapped by medical theories, social expectations, and infrastructure limitations that prevented them from using these tools effectively. They believed they were at the pinnacle of civilization, while slowly poisoning themselves with their own waste and cosmetics. The next time you turn on a tap and watch clear hot water flow effortlessly into a basin, remember the scullery maid on the stairs, hauling buckets of scalding water up 5 flights to fill her master's bath. Remember the night soil men working in darkness to prevent cities from drowning in sewage. Remember the lady applying arsenic to her skin in pursuit of an impossible ideal of purity. And ask yourself, what is the true cost of being clean? And who pays it? The Victorians eventually learned, though the lesson came at a terrible price. Science prevailed over superstition, infrastructure improved, and by the early 20th century, regular bathing had become the norm. But it took decades, and millions suffered and died from diseases that proper hygiene could have prevented. The lesson isn't just that the Victorians were wrong, it's that recognizing and correcting systemic errors is difficult, slow, and often resisted by those who benefit from existing arrangements. Their story is our story, reflected in a different mirror. They thought they had everything figured out, just as we do. They believed their way was the right way, the civilized way, the only way that made sense. And they were catastrophically wrong about something as fundamental as washing their bodies. What are we catastrophically wrong about? What obvious truths are we missing? What will people a century from now find incomprehensible about our daily practices? These are the questions the Victorian story forces us to ask, and they're questions we ignore at our peril. The past isn't just a curiosity or a source of entertainment, it's a warning about the gap between what we believe about ourselves and what we actually are. The Victorians built a magnificent civilization while living in their own filth. What contradictions are we living with? What prices are we paying for our own illusions of progress and purity? The truth about Victorian hygiene isn't just that they rarely bathed. It's that they created an entire culture around avoiding the truth about their bodies, their environment, and the human cost of their comfort. In doing so, they remind us that the most dangerous dirt isn't always the kind you can see. Sometimes it's the kind that hides behind the most polished surfaces, the most elaborate rituals, and the most confident certainties about what it means to be clean.